So in the last tutorial, I showed you the basics of how to get started creating Swift files for Flash Player 10 using MXMLC, and this is the file we created last time. Well, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you one of the most exciting new features, and that's the native 3D support in Flash Player 10. This allows you to manipulate display objects in 3D space. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new sprite subclass. I'm going to call it 3D. Let's create that. So here's my shell for my project. I'm actually going to be using Tweener in this project to do some animation in 3D space. So I'm going to import the Tweener classes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a container sprite that's essentially going to hold all of my 3D objects. So I'm going to create that here, and I'm just going to call it cont for short. I'm going to make it a sprite. And now let's go ahead and set that up. So I'm going to create a new sprite. And now I'm going to center it in the middle of my movie. So I'm going to do cont.x is equal to stage.stage width times 0.5. And actually, before we move any further, let's go ahead and set our Swift metadata, like I showed you how to do in the last tutorial. So I'm going to leave everything at the defaults here. Okay, and now for the Y, I'm going to do something similar, except this is going to be stage height. And then obviously you're going to set the Y. And now let's add this container to the display list. Okay, so now I have my container sprite. So now I'm ready to start creating my 3D objects. Well, essentially, there is no special 3D object. All display objects now, whether they be movie clips, sprites, bitmaps, they all have the ability to be manipulated in 3D space. So I'm going to create a function called makeChildren that's going to go ahead and go through and create 100 sprites and put them into 3D space. So I'm going to come down and create that function now. So makeChildren. Okay, so what I want to do is create a for loop here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually count down this for loop because that's going to help me. So when you're putting things into 3D space, there is no special Z depth that Flash does for you. So which objects are in front of one another is just based on the typical order in the display list. So I'm going to count down from 100, which is going to help with that. And let's use unsigned integer just to make it a little faster. So now what I'm going to say is var is going to start at 100, and while var I is going to start at 100, while I is greater than 0, and then I'm going to decrement I each time along. So I is going to start at 100 and it's going to go all the way down to 0. Okay, so what I want to do in this for loop is to create sprites. So I'm going to create a sprite called sp is equal to new sprite. And just to make it a little bit cooler, I'm going to set the alpha on this to 0.8 so we can kind of see the other objects that are in the 3D scene. Now, another thing we're going to do is essentially we're going to be putting these sprites in 3D space. Now, when you click on the sprite, I'm going to have the quasi camera move and focus in on that object. So again, since these are just regular display objects, they're fully interactive. So I'm going to respond to the click event for the sprite. So sprite.add event listener, and it's mouse event.click. And I'm going to have it call a function called onClick. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do now is obviously this sprite is just empty. So what I want to do is draw a rectangle in the sprite so that we can see it. So I'm going to do sp.graphics.beginFill. This is setting up the fill. And I'm going to put in a random color for the fill. So the quick way to get a random color is math.random times white. So this is going to give us a random color. Now I'm simply going to draw a rectangle. So sp.graphics.drawRect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, so the X and Y are going to be at 0, 0, and I'm going to make it 300 by 300. Okay, so now I've finished drawing a rectangle in my sprite. So now there's something there for us to see. Okay, so now I want to place this thing in 3D space. So let's first start with the X. So sp.x. And I'm going to randomize this. So I'm going to say math.random. And I'm going to say times 1000 minus 500. So this is essentially a quick way to give us a random number between negative 500 and 500. So this way there's going to be, some on either side of the origin. Okay, so I'm going to do something similar for the Y position. So again, I'm going to keep it at 1000 minus 500, except just change that to Y. Now for the Z, I want these things again because the Z depth of the 3D objects is based on the order in the display list. So I'm not going to randomize that because we're going to get behavior that isn't typical. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to set the Z equal to I times 200. Okay, so the first time this thing comes in, remember I is set at 100, it's going to do 100 times 200. And then at each time we go along, the Z position is going to be less and less, which is going to give us the behavior we're looking for. Okay, so the last thing you need to do is just to add this new sprite to the container sprite that we created. So I'm going to say cont.addChild sp. So remember, this is doing this 100 times. So let's quickly stub out that onClick function. So it's onClick. And let's just go ahead and see what we've got at this point. So now I've created a shortcut in TextMate just so when I hit Command-Alt-Return, it's going to compile it to MXMLC. But you can use the same techniques I showed you in the last tutorial if you're not using TextMate. Okay, so I've gone ahead and created that, and it was successful. So now I'm going to open it up. And now you can see at this point, here are all my 3D planes. They're just sprites, but they've been manipulated on the Z-axis to put them into 3D space. Okay, so this is good. Now what I want to do is